Hi, and welcome to GeekWire. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop, a longtime business and technology reporter here in the Seattle region. This episode of the GeekWire podcast is unlike any we've done before. It touches on some of the most contentious and disputed issues in the tech industry and in the world more broadly. It started with my basic curiosity and desire to understand something that happened back in March at GeekWire's independent Microsoft at 50 event. I was on stage interviewing Microsoft Vice Chair and President Brad Smith when the conversation was interrupted.
Yeah, the fact that we have every...
Brad Smith, you're a hypocrite. How dare you talk about nonprofits when you're fueling a genocide in Palestine? How will your children have to
All right.
be killed before you stop selling technology to the Israeli military? You claim to care about your workers who fight for peace.
All right, we're going to ask our staff to escort this gentleman out. Every day, I am thankful that we live in a country where people can stand up and express their views.
That was the first of 3 interruptions during the event. The group behind the protest, called No Azure for Apartheid, represents current and former Microsoft employees who want the company to end its cloud computing and AI contracts with the Israeli military. They cite concerns over how they believe their work is being used by Israel in the ongoing conflict in Gaza. After the protest at the GeekWire event, the group went on to demonstrate at Microsoft's internal 50th anniversary celebration and at the company's Build developer conference in Seattle. Those protests at those Microsoft events led to the dismissal of employees for what the company said were violations of company policies against disruptive behavior. Addressing the larger issues raised by the group, Microsoft said in a May 15th post that it conducted internal and external reviews and, quote, found no evidence to date that Microsoft's Azure and AI technologies have been used to target or harm people in the conflict in Gaza. We will explore Microsoft's statements in more depth later in this episode, but after watching the continued protests unfold, I decided to dig deeper and learn more. As part of that, I invited one of the organizers of No Azure for Apartheid to join me on this podcast for a conversation about the motivations behind the group, their views on Microsoft's responsibilities, and how the tech industry intersects with international conflicts. My guest is software engineer Hossam Nasr, who was fired by Microsoft last year related to protests on the Microsoft campus. In fact, he was the very protester we heard earlier, who was the first to stand up at the GeekWire event in March. What followed was a complex conversation, one that at times went beyond Microsoft's role into broader political and ethical criticisms of Israel's actions in Gaza. These are deeply polarizing issues, and we know that there are strong, divergent opinions about them. I'll be adding some after-the-fact context as we go, conveying Microsoft's responses, but also noting areas where statements and characterizations about Israel, Palestine, and Gaza are the subject of disagreement and dispute. The conversation includes detailed descriptions of the ongoing conflict in Gaza and some historical comparisons that some listeners may find disturbing or offensive. And lastly, I wanted to note that we recorded this conversation in late May, before the latest developments in the Middle East. With that, here is my conversation with Hossam Nasr, one of the organizers of No Azure for Apartheid. Hossam, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I appreciate your intro, because even just the willingness to have us on and to speak about this issue is already showing more interest and curiosity than most Microsoft executives. So I appreciate that.
I want to get a little bit into your background and the story of the group, but let's just start by getting to the core of it. What is the message that you want Microsoft and the broader public to understand about No Azure for Apartheid, the organization, and your campaign?
Totally. So we are No Azure for Apartheid, a worker-led group of Microsoft employees who are demanding Microsoft's end its complicity with Israeli apartheid and genocide by basically stopping the sale of Azure cloud and AI services to the Israeli military and the Israeli government. We have four main demands. The first one being just to end the contracts, the Azure contracts with the Israeli government and the Israeli military, to disclose and make public all the ties between Microsoft and Israeli military, government agencies, and weapons manufacturers, to publicly endorse the call for a ceasefire, and lastly, to end the discrimination, the double standards against employees who are Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim, or those who are allied and speak about the Palestinian issue. Basically, our campaign is like at the core of it, at the heart of it, is workers of conscience who refuse to have their labor be used to fuel the mass murder of Palestinians in Gaza. We all watched in horror as the scenes coming out of Gaza were live streamed on our phones. We watched the first AI-assisted live stream genocide of our lives. And then we also learned how our company, our labor, was used against our will, without our knowledge, to further those crimes. And we are people who joined Microsoft, a lot of us, because we actually believed that the company is more moral than other companies. We believed in their human rights statements and their commitment to responsible AI and other policies. And we were just shocked and horrified to learn that our labor was used in that way. And we decided to do something about it.
A United Nations panel and the International Court of Justice have said that there is indeed a plausible case that Israel's actions meet the legal definition of genocide. Israel categorically rejects that, saying it is waging a war of self-defense against Hamas. Microsoft, meanwhile, maintains that it has abided by its human rights commitments and says its contracts with Israel's Ministry of Defense are standard commercial agreements subject to its terms of service and AI code of conduct. We'll talk more about that later on. Back now to our conversation. Tell me your story. Mm-hmm. Where were you born? How did you come to the U.S.? How did you end up working for Microsoft? And at what point did this become a cause that you decided to get behind?
Totally. So I was born and raised in Egypt, and I came to the U.S. about 8 years ago to study at college. I studied at Harvard. I studied computer science and a minor in government. And there I started to get a little bit more involved in organizing around Palestine. I was involved in the Palestine Solidarity Committee, which was advocating also for the rights of Palestinian people at Harvard. And I think for me, the biggest thing, even just my time there, was just recognizing that the double standards when it comes to Palestine, the progressive except for Palestine phenomena, the Palestine exception to free speech, the fact that, the systematic and almost casual dehumanization of Palestinians that we witnessed every day. That is something that moved me a lot to specifically organize around this issue. And then I moved to Seattle about 4 years ago to work at Microsoft. It was my first job out of college. And I think for the first sort of 2 years of my time at Microsoft and just my time in Seattle in general, I wasn't really organizing as much. I wasn't doing as much activism or anything like that, mostly because I didn't know what that looked like outside the college setting, if that makes sense. And I think like many people, I was sort of moved and shaken by the start of the genocide in Gaza after October 7, 2023. And I was also moved specifically by Microsoft's response to it. I saw Microsoft, even in my time at Microsoft, in 2022, for example, they divested from Russia after its illegal invasion of Ukraine. And they also cited their commitments to fundamental human rights. Even just before I joined, one of the first things I learned about Microsoft's ethical business dealings, so to speak, was the fact that they divested a multi-million-dollar investment in an Israeli facial recognition startup called AnyVision after, campaigns were brought forward about how that AI technology is being used to facilitate the apartheid regime and surveillance of Palestinians in the West Bank. So that's, the Microsoft that I knew, although obviously I was never illusioned by, it being fully ethical in every way. But for them to come out and immediately say, we stand with Israel, to fail to mention Palestinians in Gaza at all, to ask employees to donate to Israel and have a big, on the gift portal, a big banner with an Israeli flag, and then continue to shut down conversations, retaliate against employees for simply asking Microsoft to acknowledge the humanity of their Palestinian employees. Microsoft was even scared to use the word Palestine or Palestinian or Gaza. And I think at that point, I was moved and shaken to do anything I saw in my power to do, to do whatever I can to stop this this genocide. I think I saw Microsoft and my labor and my work as an area where I can maybe have the most voice, have the most leverage. And that's how I started getting involved with, a group that later became No Azure for Apartheid. But it was really an effort to just ensure that I wash away the guilt or the complicity I felt I had by simply working for this company and learning more about how much Microsoft was actually not only paying lip service or rhetorical support to the Israeli military, but material and physical support that is, as essential to the Israeli military as physical weapons and tanks and bombs.
Microsoft points out that the company's October 10th, 2023 email and public statement from then HR chief Kathleen Hogan did explicitly acknowledge its Palestinian employees. It read, quote, "We have nearly 3,000 employees in Israel directly impacted. We have Jewish employees around the world who are also experiencing grief, fear, and anxiety as hatred and vitriol increase. We have Palestinian employees globally who are deeply concerned for the safety of their loved ones in the region and stand against these acts of terrorism." Nasser sees that acknowledgement as inadequate and, in his view, counterproductive. In a follow-up message to me, he said the public statement mentioned Palestinian employees only once, and in the context of condemning terrorism. He argued that this approach reinforced what he sees as favoritism and racial bias within the company. Microsoft disputes claims of one-sided internal actions, saying it investigates concerns regardless of political viewpoint and has taken disciplinary action on multiple sides of these issues. The internal executive email about Microsoft standing with Israel came immediately after the October 7th attacks, before the Israeli military response. Lastly, here regarding Russia, Microsoft says it has stopped all new product and service sales in Russia, as well as many other aspects of its business, and is complying with sanctions from the EU, UK, and US. Okay, and we're going to get into the differences between Microsoft's relationship and Google's relationship and Amazon's relationship with the Israeli military a little bit later on. But first, there was a, incident, you would call it, on campus last fall, on the Microsoft campus. So can you tell the story of what happened and how you ended up being dismissed as an employee?
Yeah, I think the story goes back, frankly, to when, like I was saying, when all of this started, and then employees started speaking out, and I was I was very outspoken as well within company platforms, Viva Engage, which is like this internal sort of company social media almost for people to talk, and I was signing petitions, I was talking to leadership, and I was doing everything I can to get our voices heard. And I think quickly I became a target for retaliation. One of the things that they did, for example, is I was under investigation by HR for 3 months, which led to severe sanctions against me, including financial sanctions. It was pretty much every sanction they could take short of termination. I was, banned from the Viva Engage platform for 6 months. I couldn't get promoted for a year. I had the lowest performance grade on my performance review. I had my rewards, my bonus, my salary increase all zero, and a bunch of other things, simply because I wrote a comment that said that Palestinians deserve dignity, freedom, and liberation everywhere from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And meanwhile, people that I reported, dozens of people who were actually using, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim rhetoric, calling me a member of Hamas, calling me a terrorist sympathizer, even calling me a no one who simply hates Jews. Even somebody saying between the river and the sea, Israel will forever be. At the very least, I think if that's the baseline, I think it should be applied equally, right? If saying that Palestinians deserve freedom between the river and the sea is warrants this laundry list of sanctions, how is saying between the river and the sea, Israel will forever be, is any different? And I would even argue, saying it for Israel is so much worse, because what does an Israel between the river and the sea mean, right? Israel defines itself as a Jewish state. And that means that right now, between the river and the sea, half the population is Palestinian. So what that means is it necessitates at least, one of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, or genocide to create an Israel between the river and the sea. In reality, they're doing all three. right? That's not the same for Palestine from the river to the sea.
And I want to acknowledge, I can imagine that there's people in the audience who are probably yelling at me right now through the podcast headphones, because I am a business and tech reporter. I'm not somebody who covers Middle East relations, the conflict in Gaza, and I am probably very ill-equipped to go toe-to-toe with you on these issues. So I want to acknowledge that and ask for a little bit of forgiveness from the folks out there who are probably screaming at me right now. But what would you say to those people who responded to your posts in that way and said that you were being unfair?
So I appreciate that disclaimer. And again, I think I would just, at the heart of it, I would kind of take a look back and I'd look at the big picture right now. I think that people sometimes want to go down the rabbit hole of like litigating
Right.
October the 7th, 1948, the Nakba and all that stuff. And I'm more than happy to have that conversation. But I think ultimately what is happening right now is anybody with a heart, anybody with a conscience, it's unconscionable, it's unjustifiable, right? When you see that, I'm wearing this press vest right now.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah,
Your shirt says press in big capital letters on it, which is ironic. You showed up here at a news site. But anyway, keep going. Yes.
But I'm wearing this it's a symbol of solidarity and to honor the 275 journalists who have been killed in Gaza indiscriminately by Israel. It's the biggest mass slaughter of journalists in any so-called conflict ever, even bigger than World War II. Right now, Israel is deliberately starving the Palestinian population. The vast majority of the population is facing crisis-level starvation because Israel is refusing to let in a drop of food, a drop of water. There is an increasing consensus among human rights organizations, the United Nations, and many, many governments that say that Israel's conduct is genocide. It's been found to be a plausible case of genocide in the International Court of Justice. The leaders of the Israeli military have arrest warrants for them by the International Criminal Court. So I think it is very clear. I think anybody can agree with the sentiment that we don't want to be killing children. We don't want to be starving children to death, which is already happening. Like babies are dying of malnutrition. That is just unconscionable, regardless of, the context and the history and whatever people want to get into.
Israel, for the record, has publicly rejected these kinds of allegations, saying that its military targets Hamas in response to the October 7th, 2023 attacks and takes steps to minimize civilian harm. It blames Hamas for operating in civilian areas and obstructing aid. Israel says it allows humanitarian deliveries, denies committing genocide, and maintains that it acts within international law. All right. So Microsoft, you went out into a courtyard. Right. they say you had a bullhorn.
So yeah. So ultimately, I think we ended up having a vigil on campus on October 24th, and it was partly to honor the lives of those people that we're talking about. It was because it was past the 1-year mark of the start of the genocide, and we wanted to honor the people who have been killed. And we did this as part of the GIVE campaign, which is, Microsoft's annual campaign. Every October, it gives any employee the chance to have an event on campus to fundraise for any issue that they care about. And we were fundraising for Palestinian humanitarian relief to be matched by the company. And so our visual couldn't be more peaceful. We had pictures of, people who were killed, including people who had ties to our community here. One of them is Aisha Noor, who people in the Seattle community would remember as a University of Washington graduate who was killed by an Israeli sniper in the West Bank. We honored her among many others who were killed. And it was during lunchtime. We were in a big open space on East Campus. Anybody who's familiar with the space knows, it's very, very spacious, very open. And the day before the visual was supposed to happen, Microsoft actually tried to shut it down. They tried to get us to cancel it or move it somewhere that's public. And they wouldn't tell us why. Like they said, this is just non-approved. This is non-compliant with the policies. And we asked to see which policies and they cited this policy, the non-business use of Microsoft facilities, which ironically, in the text of the policy says that an exception is for GIVE events. And when we pointed that out, they came up with a different excuse that we also addressed. And then ultimately, the day of, they again came to us in person while the visual was happening and tried to tell us to go away, to go somewhere public. They even threatened to call the police on us. all the while refusing to name why it's not authorized, who's not authorizing it, what policies are we violating.
So I asked them about this.
Yeah.
I asked them about this, and they said, essentially, you were told before the event that you couldn't hold an event with bullhorns on campus and disrupt work. They told you that if you wanted to do that, you could do that from city property, but you chose to come to campus anyway. And they distinguished between your event or your activities and the Palestinians at Microsoft Group, which is part of the Give campaign. And they gave me a full statement on this that they put out at the time. I'm sure you've seen the statement. Yeah. So
the bullhorns thing is very interesting because that is something that they came up with after the fact.
Okay.
Like, how could they have known we were gonna? And first of all, we didn't bring bullhorns. We just brought it was just like a microphone and like a speaker. It wasn't like a bullhorn, and it wasn't disrupting any business because, like I said, it was during lunch and it was in a big open space. Like nobody was disrupted by events, and there are Give events that happen that are much more disruptive to business. But the interesting thing is, again, they came up with this excuse after the fact. Nobody before the fact told us no bullhorns or anything like that.
So this is obviously in dispute. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. The company says this other thing. I get it. I get it. Okay. You were let go. You were
that same
fired.
day. That same day I got a phone call.
This is not in dispute.
That is not in dispute. That same day I got a phone call at 9 p.m. from Microsoft HR telling me you've been terminated effective immediately. You're not allowed back to work for Microsoft. You're not allowed back on Microsoft property, owned or leased. And effective immediately, you have no access to Microsoft networks. And yeah, they just cited that non-compliance with Microsoft policies, and they left it vague like that.
Jumping in here after the fact to say that Microsoft disputes a number of these details, here is the company's full statement on this issue. Quote, "We remain dedicated to maintaining a professional and respectful work environment and provide many avenues for all voices to be heard. But importantly, we ask that this be done in a way that does not disrupt business operations and be aligned to our company policies and behavior expectations. We do not permit employees to use devices like bullhorns or speakers in public areas on our campuses to disrupt the work of their colleagues. We were clear about our policies in advance with the event organizers and instructed that this gathering take place on public property. The organizers chose to disregard this guidance and were terminated." Microsoft says in a statement that it, quote, "investigates concerns without regard to viewpoint and imposes discipline based on the facts of each matter. It adds, it would be inaccurate to frame this story otherwise," end quote. Okay. They called you. You were fired.
Yeah.
What happened next?
So I think it was clear to me at that point that I needed to use this opportunity to continue the campaign and to make sure that just because they were fired two people, that doesn't slow down or silence people and not have that chilling effect that they wanted it to have. So my first reaction, my first instinct was just to check in on everybody else in the campaign and everybody else who was at the visual, make sure, like, what's the blast radius here? I had no idea. Thankfully, it turned out to be just two people, myself and Abdo Muhammad, who's another Egyptian who was also fired. And so I think the two of us, it was very clear to us that we needed to use this opportunity to highlight, Microsoft's, like, not just relationship with the Israeli military and complicity in the genocide, but also I think this was a culmination of Microsoft's pattern of discrimination and retaliation against its Arab and Muslim and Palestinian workers. So I think that became our focus. Like, we wanted to use whatever spotlight we were given at that point to talk about that. And thankfully, I think that it didn't have the effect that Microsoft wanted. I think a lot more people joined after that, joined the campaign, wanted to organize with us. Our movement grew. Many more people signed our petition, which now has, last I checked, like over 1,800 workers who have signed it. And I think you've seen how our movement has grown kind of firsthand when, one of our first sort of public confrontations of Microsoft executives came at the GeekWire event on March 20th.
Yep. And so I should just sort of give a series of explanations here. So also, just as a disclaimer, I feel like I need to say, so Microsoft, through our business team, I'm not involved in this, but they underwrite GeekWire's civic coverage. The best analogy I can give you is like NPR, when a corporation comes in and puts its funding toward a certain type of coverage, and then the coverage is independent of that. Mm-hmm. They did not sponsor this event that we held. GeekWire, over the past several months, has been doing an editorial independent series It's sponsored by Accenture, which is sort of a PBS-style underwriter of the series. They didn't have any control. Microsoft didn't have any control over the series. And as part of that, we did an event where we had Brad Smith, Microsoft's president, Steve Ballmer, the former CEO, the company's current largest shareholder there, and Nathan Myhrvold, the former CTO. Tell me how you got to the point where you decided that the next move in your strategy was to go and start disrupting places where Microsoft executives were speaking.
So I think it became clear, we had tried, we continue to try so many things. So many of speaking of Microsoft statements, one of the things Microsoft loves to say in its statements is, we provide many avenues for employees to voice their concerns. I have memorized that line at this point. And we have tried pretty much every single one of these avenues. We've tried questions on Viva Engaged. We've tried engaging with their, human rights reporting portal. We've tried even filing HR cases and whatever, and engaging directly with leadership. And we have, like I said, 1,800 signatures on their petition. And pretty much everything we tried to do was met with either silence, like completely ignoring us, or, that's at best. At worst, they just repress us, deleting questions from EMAs. Like every time we show up for these Ask Me Anythings or Q&As with leadership, we would always make sure to have questions about Gaza there and make sure that they're upvoted so they're visible. And they still would delete them, ignore them, refuse to answer them, or at worst, retaliate against people who are consistently talking about this issue.
Microsoft says executives do not answer every question in internal Ask Me Anything sessions, and they try to choose questions that relate to broad sets of employees.
Some people were forced to quit, and some people who are even not really known in the media, but who have been, intimidated and harassed into leaving the company because of it. So we felt like we had no option but to refuse to be ignored and to force them to listen to us, to confront them where they are. And I think specifically with the 50th anniversary stuff, it was clear Microsoft was really using this as a moment to highlight their legacy, right? To highlight their shiny image that they wanted to portray, celebrate 5 decades of innovation, as they like to say. And to us, it was clear that we cannot allow people to we cannot allow these executives to celebrate on Palestinian blood. It's very clear to us that Microsoft's legacy is genocide at this point, and that will be its legacy.
Really?
History will not look kindly upon the people who facilitated the Holocaust of our time. Take a company like Siemens, for example, that has facilitated, was complicit in the Holocaust of the Nazis, right? That is something that, 80 years later now, they cannot wash away from their history. I think this moment will be looked upon very similarly.
Holocaust analogies are contested by historians and scholars and Jewish institutions that reject comparisons between the Holocaust and contemporary conflicts and maintain that the systematic, state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany represents a historically unique event that cannot be accurately compared to other events or conflicts. Let's take a break here. Coming up later on the show, we will be talking more about the broader tech industry and the evolution of its relationships with militaries around the world. We'll be right back with more of my conversation with Hossam Nasr, one of the organizers of the group No Azure for Apartheid. Going back now to our conversation, I shared my impressions of Hossam Nasr's protest at GeekWire's independent Microsoft at 50 event in Seattle in March. I was sitting up there and I was like, okay, I knew this was going to happen potentially. And okay, that was good. He did a good job. And then Brad Smith gave a comment back.
Right.
And then when it happened the second time and the third time, I will say my natural reaction as somebody organizing the event was like, oh, come on.
Right.
Come on. I mean, the point's been made. At what point do you say, okay, we're going so far with this that we might be losing the people who might be neutral, who would otherwise be inclined to listen to our message?
I think that is a good point. But I think ultimately, I would frankly question, if people are inconvenienced by people speaking up about, the Holocaust of our time, why aren't you joining us in speaking up about it? Why is that an inconvenience to you? And ultimately, I think it's going to be enough when they actually take action. Because the point is not to disrupt. The point is not to be loud or to make or to have the spotlight on us. The point is ultimately to make it untenable to be complicit in the genocide. So, all of our protests will end tomorrow if Microsoft chooses to do the most basic moral decision that it can make, which is to simply end its contracts with the Israeli military.
So the company said it did an investigation internally and externally. Now, I tried to get them to tell me who the external firm was. They wouldn't. They said in these reviews, they found no evidence that their Azure or AI technologies were used by the Israeli military to harm civilians in Gaza. They acknowledged limitations in their visibility, particularly regarding on-premises deployments of their software, and government cloud systems operated by other providers like Google and Amazon under what's called Project Nimbus.
Right.
And it's important to point out here, Project Nimbus is something that Microsoft and Oracle also bid on. And the difference here is that Nimbus is kind of like a custom thing, custom infrastructure, services, AI tools, where potentially, as according to some reports, the Israeli military actually helped to design these things. Whereas Microsoft says its supply of technology to the Israeli military is basically off-the-shelf stuff, like anybody could buy under an enterprise software license. And so I guess my big picture question for you is it realistic or fair to expect them to sever ties with a U.S. ally's defense ministry? And wouldn't that set a precedent across all sorts of countries?
I think it would set the right kind of precedent. It would set the precedent that Microsoft itself has set and has claimed that it abides by. The precedent that they are not going to sell technology that is being used to harm fundamental human rights. That is the precedent that will set. And if people have issue with that, they should talk to Microsoft. That is something that Microsoft itself has done in the past. When they divested from apartheid South Africa in 1986, when they divested from Russia in 2022, and when they divested even from an Israeli facial recognition company in 2021. So we're simply asking Microsoft to abide by its own commitments, by its own precedent, by its own commitments to human rights. Otherwise, what people are saying is that just because it's a U.S. ally or just because it is, it happens to be Israel, then human rights don't apply anymore. Then Palestinians' life doesn't have value. That the 15,000 children that have been killed and counting are ungrievable and unmournable and unworthy of protection. That is simply something I refuse to accept. In my opinion, and let's just actually talk about what that statement said, because in my opinion, I think it was very out of touch with where the employees are and where their concerns are, according to Microsoft's own language, because there are actually three very important admissions that were hidden within that statement, right? Number one, they admit that they are selling not Word, not Office, not Excel. That they sell Azure AI, cloud services, translation services, and advanced cloud capabilities. We know what the Israeli military uses cloud and AI for. We know that, for example, there's a clip from Rachel Dimbinsky, who is the commander of the Mamram unit, the tech and computing unit in the Israeli military. And there's a video of her talking about how the use of so-called civilian cloud like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft has allowed them very significant operational effectiveness in Gaza. Quote, word for word, and how if it wasn't for these so-called civilian cloud, they wouldn't be able to be as effective in Gaza. And we also know that the Israeli military develops these AR targeting systems like Lavender, the Gospel, Where's Daddy, and others to automate and accelerate the targeting of Palestinians in Gaza. So that's number one. That was a very key admission. Number two is they themselves admit that following October 7, they authorized what they called limited use emergency use of their technologies outside the scope of the normal use policies.
Right. And they said that. And then they also said, and they turned down some requests for specific applications.
Sure.
So they were saying they're drawing a line somewhere.
Right. What is that line? What are they rejecting? What are they approving? And again, this is, part of, I think to me it's funny for them to say that we're not going to release the name like if they believe in this investigation and they believe that it's credible and reliable and honest, like why would that company be subject to
Well, you've
to criticism or
struck
targeting?
fear into their hearts.
Well, that's the thing. If the investigation truly was, independent and truthful, you have no reason to go after them.
But then you'll show up at that company's annual meeting and be standing up.
I think, but my point is, if Microsoft believed in the authenticity of that investigation, they would have no reason to fear that, right? But again, like they admitted that they have authorized this use even beyond the scope of their usual use policy.
In that case,
yeah. And then the third admission they did is that, like you said, they don't actually have visibility onto how their technologies are being used on premises. So the wording they used is very carefully chosen. They didn't say our technology isn't used to harm people. They said there is no evidence. We have found no evidence, right? So if the treasure of evidence is locked behind a key and you can't open that treasure of evidence and you say we have found no evidence, that's essentially what Microsoft is saying. And I think there's also just the part that's frankly funny of, they did the meme of we investigated ourselves and found no wrongdoing. in reality, like I think they should do an independent, like third-party public, investigation. And the reality is the claim on its face that their technology is not being used to harm civilians is ridiculous, because these reports that they are citing, they're not just saying that Microsoft is selling AI and cloud to the Israeli military, full stop. They are saying that exactly the kind of units that is being sold to, the kind of applications that it's being used for, the fact that they're used in highly classified combat and intelligence operations, to use their words, the fact that it's used to house the Target Bank, the Rolling Stone system, the Palestinian Civil Registry, all of these like crucial systems that enable Israel to commit this mass murder in Palestine.
So are you basing your understanding of the situation and these technical nuances of what Microsoft's technology is being used for on your own internal knowledge from people at the company, or on things like the Associated Press report that came out that detailed this? Because Microsoft has said that AP report that came out, last year, they wish now they would have pushed back on that and corrected what they say are inaccuracies in that report.
Well, they still have the opportunity to do that if they truly believe that. I am actually in touch with the reporters on that report, and I asked them about Microsoft's statement, and they actually released a follow-up to it where they asked Microsoft more in-depth questions about that investigation that they did. And they asked specific questions about, like you said, what requests were denied and what requests were accepted and that sort of stuff. And Microsoft had the opportunity to correct the record if that's what they believe, and they still declined to comment on their requests. Microsoft still today has the chance to correct the record if they feel like any reporting from the AP or Plus 972 or The Guardian is factually inaccurate. To answer your question, though, I think this sort of knowledge or analysis is based on a lot of things. It is based on things that, as a campaign of Microsoft workers, we have evidence for internally, from usage data to support tickets to other kind of internal information that we cannot unfortunately discuss at liberty here, in addition to the public investigations that were done by the AP, Plus 972, The Guardian, and Dropsite News and others, which rely not only on information from Microsoft, but from the Israeli side as well, like people who work on those systems from the Israeli side. And again, like the words of Israeli officials themselves, who brag actually about how essential Google, Microsoft, and Amazon Cloud is to their operations.
One place you did not protest was at the Technology Alliance luncheon, and Brad Smith, the Microsoft president and vice chair, spoke there.
Well, I think we have to start by acknowledging that the current situation in the Middle East is, a terrible humanitarian tragedy of our time for civilians on both sides of this conflict. Whether it's the 1,200 Israeli civilians who were either killed or raped or held hostage, including some people who are still being held hostage every day since October 7th, 2023, or the more than 50,000 Palestinian civilians who are estimated now to have lost their lives. And every day that war continues, is just a terrible day, I think, for humanity. And we have employees, and one of the great things about our employees, I think every company's employees, is they're always heartfelt. They're always guided by good intentions. And we have employees, especially Palestinian employees, that are concerned not only about what's happening, but are asking what role is our technology playing. And earlier this year, there was some reporting, there were a couple of stories in Israel that I think in hindsight, we look at and say those were inaccurate and we probably should have come out right away and provided more information because it caused concerns about how our AI and cloud services were being used by the Israeli Ministry of Defense in the war effort, specifically surveillance and targeting. And so we did an internal review. I really wanted to make sure that our internal review was right, so we brought in an external firm to do an additional review. Look, what I can say is, to the best of our knowledge and after an enormous amount of work, we don't think our technology is being used for those purposes. We do an important work to defend the cybersecurity of the State of Israel. We do important work in a variety of other functions, but not for the kinds of functions that are targeting or engaging in these kinds of military operations. That is done either with on-premise, with the Israeli military's own computers, or through a contract they have for government operations. There are 2 cloud providers that do that work. We're not one of them. And we're trying to contribute to the flow of information while also respecting that people who want to see that war end are definitely, I'll say, on the side of angels. We should all want to see that war end as soon as possible.
So I think one thing to point out is, notice again the choice of words here. He said, to the best of our knowledge. We don't think, right? But also I think there is a more subtle choice of words even earlier on when he's talking about the humanitarian crisis, as he calls it, in the Middle East, where he talked about how 1,200 Israelis were killed, held hostage, raped, etc. But when he talks about the Palestinians, it's Palestinians who have lost their lives, right? That's a constant sort of function, unfortunately, of how Palestinians are portrayed in the media, where even though today Palestinians, Israel is starving, killing, maiming Palestinians, actually raping Palestinians, taking Palestinians as human hostages, taking tens of thousands as just detaining them with no charge or trial, torturing them in mass prisons, and there's multiple scandals that have come out about the torture and rape inside Israeli prisons, and yet those are always just marginalized in this kind of discourse. It is Palestinians are always dehumanized. Their suffering is secondary. This suffering must be as a sort of addition to talking about Israeli suffering, even when, again, it's been 20 months of this kind of violence happening against Palestinians. And I think I want to talk about this, even though that's not the main point he was talking about, but I want to talk about this a little bit because this is, again, a line where he is repeated in the statement that was issued on May 15th. And it was also something that he said after I interrupted him at the GeekWire event, where he talks about Microsoft's philanthropy and how they, donate to both sides and all of that. First of all, Microsoft, even within the context of employee matching and donations and stuff like that, Microsoft allows employee matching for illegal Israeli settlements that are illegal under international law, as well as an organization called Friends of the IDF that, again, directly support the Israeli military, while to this day, Microsoft employees cannot have their donations matched to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is providing crucial life-saving humanitarian assistance to Palestinians everywhere, including in Gaza. It has been removed from the portal for employee matching in early last year, and to this day has not been reinstated. That's in addition to the fact that frankly, at this point, it's this sort of impression of two sides is well beyond the mark at this point. When, as I said, Palestinians are the ones who are being killed and raped and tortured and abducted and starved. And it is every day that we see scenes of Palestinian children being decapitated and torn to pieces with US made bombs and with American, technology. It's at this point, honestly, offensive to be talking about the Palestinian suffering as a marginal add-on to talking about Israeli suffering. But then to go back to the main point on, the technology and how it's used and stuff like that, I think, like I said, even he cannot get himself to say definitively that Microsoft technology is not being used in targeting and surveillance of Palestinians. He says, we don't think, and he says to the best of our knowledge, even while admitting that, like he said, most of that stuff does happen on premises, and Microsoft does sell technology that is used on premises. I think about half of the technology they provide to the Israeli military is used on premises, and they admit they don't know how their technology is used on premises. So that alone kind of debunks his claim. But also that standard is not a standard that we would apply in any other context of, would he say the same about Russia? Like Microsoft technology is not being used in the surveillance and targeting of Ukrainians, therefore it's okay to continue arming them. Would he have said the same about South Africa? The standard that was applied to like South Africa and Russia, for example, is actually even much higher than the standard we're asking for in this case, where they divested from the entire South African economy, the entire Russian economy, because they recognize that any support of that economy that is committing these crimes against humanity is a tacit support and is complicity in a way. Let alone if you're selling that technology directly to the military that is committing these crimes, right? So even if it was just Excel and Word, which it is not, that still would be something that is very morally objectionable.
Why not target Amazon and Google as well? And I realize other groups have done that too.
Yeah.
There's, especially at Google, there's been a lot of this same kind of disagreement, doesn't begin to describe it. But why wouldn't you expand your efforts to also include Amazon and Google?
No Azure for Apartheid. We are part of the broader No Tech for Apartheid campaign, which mainly targets Google and Amazon for their $1.2 billion Project Nimbus contract. That's what Brad Smith was referring to earlier. So we are part of the broader sort of network and organization that does target all those three companies. But for us at No Azure for Apartheid, I mean, there's a couple reasons why we focus most of our work on Microsoft. Number one is that we are Microsoft workers, and that is where we have the most knowledge and the most leverage and the most familiarity with that space and how those decisions are made and where we can be effective. And ultimately, that's where we feel like we can make the most impact. I think the fact that, in my opinion, our campaign has been able to be very effective in partly is because this is a worker voice and this is a labor issue. And it's not just people on the outside, people in the street, protesting against Microsoft. It is a partnership. I think that that's part of the reason that our campaign is really effective. But I think a second important reason as well is that actually based on the reporting, despite what Brad Smith wants to portray, it appears that Microsoft is the main, and when it comes to specifically the Israeli military, not the overall government, because we need to remember the $1.2 billion contract between Google and Amazon, that is for the entire government, not just the Ministry of Defense. Microsoft is actually probably the most complicit company. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is, the Palestinian-led call to boycott companies that are complicit in apartheid and genocide against Palestinians, they actually labeled Microsoft as a priority boycott target because, their words, not mine, Microsoft is perhaps the most complicit tech company in apartheid and genocide against Palestinians.
But how can you say that given that Google and Amazon are like, they've got the actual contract where it's being, bespoke, created for the military, not just something that they would give to every company or country?
Right. Well, I think it's because despite that, Microsoft, before Project Nimbus, which was only signed in 2021, Azure was the main cloud provider to the Israeli government and to the Israeli military in particular. And it appears from reporting that the Israeli military has been resistant to shift entirely to Nimbus, and that in reality, Azure still remains the main cloud provider for the Israeli military, and Azure is still tasked with specifically the most sensitive and the most confidential workloads for the Israeli military. According to one of the reports, Microsoft has a footprint in all major technological infrastructure within the Israeli military. So it appears despite Nimbus, they maintain this very close relationship that is even if, the dollar amount, as far as we know, is like $133 million, that's like 10 times less than Project Nimbus, but that is reserved again for the most confidential and the most sensitive workloads, which ultimately means, combat and surveillance operations.
I want to go big picture here before we end. It seems like there's been a broader shift in big tech companies in the way that they respond and relate to internal dissent. Do you see what has happened at Microsoft involving you and your colleagues as part of a wider crackdown on tech worker activism? I mean, there's some reporting this week in the Washington Post on that. And if so, how does that change the way you approach your campaign?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think how I would like to answer this question is, I think it's not just a crackdown on, worker activism. I think there is a broader shift within big tech to be sort of part and parcel of the military industrial complex. I do believe at this point, given how crucial cloud and AI have become in warfare and how we are witnessing in Gaza now, the world's first AI-assisted genocide. And unfortunately, if we let it happen, it's not going to be the last. That's historically been the case. I do believe big tech is now the military industrial complex of the 21st century. And cloud and AI are, dual use technologies and are the sort of the bombs and the bullets and the tanks and the planes of this era of warfare and oppression. And I think you see that pattern happen across big tech as well. Google removing their restrictions on the use of their technology for military purposes. OpenAI amending their policies, where before they had a very strict ban on using their technology for military purposes, and now they amended it to allow it in, quote, national security uses. And then shortly after that, there was actually the first confirmed sale of OpenAI to military purposes that was for the US DoD, used in a unit that is, does like operations in Africa. And there's this wider trend. I mean, I think Palantir is probably the leading sort of company there, and they're very brazen and upfront about it. They don't even try to hide it. But even the companies that have tried to put on a veneer of morality and ethics, that is starting to erode. And I think Microsoft is one of those companies that has tried its best to put on that face and put on that veneer, and then that is starting to erode as well. So I see that's part of it. This crackdown is part of it, where before they wanted to appear as like this really fun and exciting and engaging place to work. All voices are heard, your criticisms are welcome, and that sort of thing. Microsoft was no exception. They had all these forums for people to ask questions and whatnot, but we never started to actually challenge their deep complicity in the military-industrial complex. That's when the erosion of that started to happen. We saw that at Google, where they fired 50 people for protesting Project Nimbus last year. Even people who were not part of the protest, people who were just passing by, people who had literally just passed flyers or whatever, were fired. And I think you're starting to see that with Microsoft. For example, the most egregious, in my opinion, thing that they have done, and one of the most egregious things I've seen any tech company done, is they banned the use of the word Palestine or Gaza in any email internally.
So did they actually ban it? Because they would say, emails aren't being blocked unless they're being sent to large numbers of random distribution groups. That's what they said.
That's demonstrably false. I mean, that's what they said internally too. But, we've had, like I said, we're a worker-led campaign. We have people test this internally. Even if you send an email to yourself or you send an email to one other person, whether inside or outside the company, any email outgoing from an employee's inbox that had any of these words would get blocked. Some of them would get, delayed by anywhere from 10 minutes to over 24 hours. Some of them would get lost completely. It's clear that there's some sort of human verification involved, because people who are based in other time zones, if they would send during their business hours when people here are asleep, those would get delayed for hours, versus if it's during US or Pacific working hours, it would be more 15, 20 minutes. But still, the reality is, even people who are sending emails to HR reporting, incidents of hate or anti-Palestinian sentiment or whatever, because in their email to HR, it had the word Palestine, those emails were even blocked.
Okay.
So
And has that persisted from what you've seen?
as far as I'm aware, it's to
Okay.
this day, it's happening.
Microsoft said in a statement on this issue that sending unsolicited emails to large numbers of employees at work was not appropriate. It has an established forum for employees who've opted into a variety of issues for that reason. It added that a number of emails were sent to tens of thousands of employees across the company, and it took steps to try and reduce those emails to those that had not opted in. On that issue of the broader trends in the big tech companies, is AI giving companies more leverage here? And by that, I mean, employees don't have the same sway that they did even 2-3 years ago when
Yeah.
you had all sorts of bonuses being handed out for retention. And
Right.
you've got a situation now where Copilot and ChatGPT and other forms of AI can do more and more of the typical employee's jobs. And so it doesn't seem like employees have as much leverage as they might have.
I think that is true, but I think my interpretation of it, and I am, maybe a little bit too cynical, but my interpretation of it is that they have less leverage because executives think that. They think that they can expend this many people and replace them with AI, because frankly, a lot of these executive jobs are replaceable by AI. But the reality is the majority of people who actually do the day-to-day work, they're not as replaceable as they would want to believe. Maybe at some point they will be, but I do think that this expendability of workers and their willingness to lay off thousands of people, hoping they will replace them by AI, I think they will live to regret that.
I don't think it's a one-for-one replacement, and this is a bigger picture discussion about the tech industry. I think it's more like there's certain amounts of the job that can be done by AI through things like GitHub Copilot and pair programming or peer programming with AI. And so therefore you don't have quite the long-term need that you would otherwise. I don't think it's a one-for-one. Here's our new agent that's going to come in and do this person's job. It's more
Sure.
about an efficiency thing. Maybe we can conclude by just sort of using you as a bit of a proxy for what's next. Like, you came into the tech industry, you wanted to work for Microsoft.
Yeah.
You came to Seattle to do this. Like, do you see yourself working in tech again?
I don't see myself working in big tech, for
Not
sure.
big tech.
Not big tech, for sure. Maybe tech, but I think that I cannot anymore tolerate feeling like my job or my labor is being used to just make the world a worse place. Now, even if it's not necessarily facilitating the genocide, which is a huge red line, but I had felt even before the genocide in Palestine and everything, I still felt like this has strayed so far beyond this sort of idealistic idea I had of tech and working for tech. I got passionate about this field when I was 11 years old, and the Arab Spring was happening in Egypt, where I was from. And back then, there was so much tech optimism that I bought into about how tech is a force for social good and how it could be a tool for democratization and a tool for people to actually fight the system rather than become a tool of the system to oppress, surveil, and repress people. And I think at this point, I can't go back to that system anymore. I still like to code. That's the problem. I still like to solve problems, and I like coding challenges and that sort of thing. And maybe I'm too much of a nerd. So I hope to find a way to do both. But if I have to choose, I'll choose my morals.
Maybe your own company is the only way to really do it. Have you thought about?
I have thought about it, and I think it's possible. It's possible that's really the only way to do it at this point.
Do you see a startup out there that aligns with this, not only your morals, but the cause?
I think there's a lot of need for that, in my opinion. I think it's the hard part is, if you're in this day and age, to do a startup, you need to make money, right? Ultimately, it needs to be a profit-seeking business, and unfortunately, there is not a lot of money to be made doing the right thing. Unfortunately, I think there is a way to carve out a space for it, and I still need to explore that more and figure out what that looks like. I want to believe it's possible, though. I want to believe that, big tech and sort of evil tech, so to speak, doesn't have monopoly over that technology, over innovation, over, the things that I enjoy doing. And I want to believe that building tech for good is possible.
So for people who want to know more about No Azure for Apartheid, is there a place they can go to find out more?
Yeah, so you can follow us on Instagram at No Azure for Apartheid, or on Twitter, No Azure for Apartheid, or on our website, noazurefораpartheid.com. There you can find our socials, but also sign our petition. There's a petition for Microsoft workers, but also for the general public that people can sign as well. And if any, Microsoft worker out there is listening, then we will welcome you with open arms. There's always a place and opportunity for people to get involved, even if they're not yelling at an auditorium. I think that there is so much work that happens behind the scenes to make moments like this possible. The vast majority of the work is nameless and anonymous, and there is a lot of room for people to get involved, even if they don't want to put their employment at risk. So, just reach out.
Hossam Nasr, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I will link from the show notes to all of the things that we talked about, coverage on GeekWire and elsewhere about all of the activities of No Azure for Apartheid, Microsoft's responses, and what the company has said, so you can read more about everything. Kurt Milton edited this episode. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. We'll be back next week with a new episode of the GeekWire podcast.